event is one that took place yesterday. It's the famous dog that didn't bark. There was supposed to be a demonstration, a day of rage in Saudi Arabia. It was crushed completely by the security forces. A few people dared to march, nothing else. I'm sure there were many sighs of relief in Western capitals and in the autocratic regimes in the region, in Israel. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the jewel in the crown. That's where most of the oil is. And one of the most harsh and brutal states in the region. Also the center of radical Islamism, the main funder of jihadism, and a long time close ally of the United States and before it, Britain. And the demonstration did not happen there, which is quite important. They did happen in other places. The first one was actually in Western Sahara, which is occupied by Moroccan forces in violation of Security Council resolutions. It was a non-violent demonstration, brutally crushed. That this is a UN protectorate. It's supposed to be decolonized, so an inquiry, there was an appeal of the Security Council for at least an inquiry, but that was blocked by France, which is the protector of the dictatorships in its former colonial domains. However, it did spread to Tunisia, then later Egypt, the most important country, and beyond. These things like these don't come out of nowhere. There's a background, and it's worth thinking about a little, just to also tell us something about the future, and even more important, it tells us something about ourselves, just as the non-event in Saudi Arabia did. In Egypt, as I'm sure you know, the amazing, quite spectacular uprisings were initiated by a small group of young people, tech-savvy, using contemporary technology. They succeeded in organizing mobilizing forces way beyond anything they anticipated, but partly because the ground was ready for it. They had a name. They called themselves the April 6th movement. The reason for the name is that on April 6th, 2008, there was a plan for one of the many actions of the very militant Egyptian labor movement. They were going to have large-scale strikes in one of the major industrial complexes, the Mahala textile plants, and there were to be solidarity demonstrations and so on. That was crushed by the Egyptian security forces, so it's kind of like the dog that didn't bark. That was insignificant and didn't make it to the Western attention because it was properly crushed by our favorite dictator. However, it was noticed in Egypt. Victims have a way of perceiving the world differently from those who hold the clubs. And the April 6th movement was named after this non-event. Incidentally, shortly after the crushing of the April 6th strike and solidarity action, President Obama went to Egypt for his famous Cairo speech, outreach to the Muslim world. He was asked on the way whether he would say anything about Mubarak's authoritarian regime, and he said he wouldn't. He said that Mubarak is a good man with good things, keeping stability. There's nothing to criticize. The principle is, as long as things are quiet, populations are passive, obedient, distracted by something else, that everything's fine. That holds for domestic society as well, I should say, but certainly in regions like that. Tony Blair, who tends to be a little slow on the take, he basically repeated that right in the middle of the uprisings. You probably saw immensely courageous and a force for good. This is shortly before even the army told him to get lost. But there is a background, and it's worth remembering. If you take a look at what's happened so far, the reasons why the Western countries are minimally supportive, I mean rhetorically supportive, but in a muted fashion, is that so far there has really been no regime change. There's been a change of names, which is important. They've gotten rid of some of the most repressive apparatus. The press is quite free. There are labor actions continuing. All of that's important. There are moves towards a limited amount of democracy, at least. The military is still in control in Egypt and in Tunisia, and they're not going to give it up easily. So a lot depends on the scale and intensity of protests and actions, and also the support given to the youth. That makes a lot of difference. But at the very least, there'll be a significant legacy and implications for other societies and a kind of a basis from which to go forward the next time something breaks out. The significance of what has happened was described pretty accurately in the business press, which often tends to be more accurate. They have an audience of readers who have to have a realistic conception of the world since they own it. The Wall Street Journal wrote that their leading political correspondent, he wrote that the fall of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak marks a historic shift in the Middle East, away from the power structure America has leaned on for the past 3 decades, actually much longer, and towards a new one still being shaped by forces that the United States and its allies haven't yet learned to control. That last phrase is crucial. An assumption is we have to control them, learn how to control them, haven't yet done it, so there's a task for the future. That goes way back, that concept, back at the end of the Second World War, when the United States was essentially taking over from Britain as a global hegemon. Plans were laid for how to run the world, including the British Empire, which the U.S. was taking over, much to the discomfiture of Britain, but they couldn't do much about it then. And a crucial element was Middle East oil resources. These are described by the State Department as a stupendous resource, the greatest material prize in world history. We've got to have it. And it was pointed out by one of Roosevelt's major advisors that control of the Middle East can yield substantial control of the world. Of course it will. And that remains the case, of course, in British planning and actions. It goes back much earlier to the beginnings of the oil age, at least, in fact, beyond that. So these are old, deep-seated policies that aren't going to be abandoned easily. And there are good reasons for it. I mean, that is the major energy resource of the world for some time to come. And it does yield control of the world if you control it. So we can understand the concern of the Wall Street Journal that we haven't yet learned to control the new forces, the new wave of forces that's developing. It's also worth remembering that what's just happened in the Middle East and the Western reaction to it is also not new. It repeatedly happens that it becomes difficult to sustain some favored dictator. It's happened dozens of times in the past years. And there's a standard game plan, which is being followed this time as well. What you do is support the dictator with expressing your love and so on until the last possible minute. And then when it becomes completely impossible to continue, maybe the army's turned against him or the business world shifts against him or something like that. At that point, send him off to pasture somewhere, try to forget about him. Sometimes put him on a U.S. Air Force plane and fly him to exile with half the country's treasury if happened to need it. But anyway, put aside, issue bringing declarations about your passionate love of democracy and freedom and so on, and then try to restore the old regime as much as possible. And that's happened so many times that it takes a real dedicated amnesia to fail to notice that what's happening now is routine. It's happened in the case of Marcos in the Philippines, Haiti, Shah of Iran for Somoza, Suharto, of course, killers. It just goes on and on, same story, constantly. Try to maintain what you can. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Well, there's a good deal more to say about all this, and when I turn to other issues in the region. Another dog that hasn't barked is the Palestinian territories, the occupied territories. They've been quite quiet. In the West Bank, they're kept quiet by an army, originally run by the U.S. General Keith Dayton, with the help of Israel and Jordan. It has succeeded. We can argue about all sorts of things to say about it, but it has succeeded in keeping the West Bank quiet. Dayton himself gave a talk to a pro-Israel research center in the United States, in which he applauded the achievement of his army in preventing any even a demonstration of support, let alone action, at the time of the Israeli invasion of Gaza in January 2009. In fact, he said the army was so successful in repressing the population that Israel was able to remove forces from the West Bank to Gaza to participate in the attack. But that impressed the Obama administration as well. Senator John Kerry is sort of Obama's point man for the Middle East. He's head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he gave an important speech right after that, in which he said, Israel has been desperately seeking peace for decades, never had a legitimate partner, couldn't get anywhere. But finally it has a legitimate partner for peace, the Palestinian Authority. And he had one bit of evidence, what I just described. By now, the Palestinian Authority has a U.S.-run army that is able to repress the population sufficiently so that even a demonstration of support for our protest against the Gaza atrocities couldn't happen. So now things are looking up. There's a chance for a democracy of peace. Again, an insight into ourselves, our own more sort of progressive elements. I won't talk about the partial ones. Well, that's the West Bank. In Gaza, Hamas is in control, and they are very tough. They're like Saudi Arabia, so no protests there, no uprisings. I should mention, incidentally, that maybe it's obvious, that if what didn't happen yesterday in Saudi Arabia had not happened in Iran, there'd be front page headlines, outraged editorials, government statements, terrible dictatorship, people can't protest. I haven't read today's papers, but I don't expect. I'll be pleasantly surprised if there's anything like that about Saudi Arabia, very much surprised. Well, that's the quiescence of the territories is partly just repression, and partly it's the residue of the extreme violent repression of the Second Intifada. It took a while for that to wear off. Well, there are many complicated problems in the world where it's very hard to even conjure up a solution. Kashmir, difficult to think how to proceed. But this is actually one of the easy ones. It's a very simple solution, short-term at least, solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And furthermore, God knows what it is. There's an overwhelming national consensus, has been for decades, on a straightforward settlement, short-term settlement, namely a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe some mutual modification, with rights, guarantees of the right of peace and security of all states in the region, including Israel and the new Palestinian state, within secure and recognized borders. That wording I've just quoted from UN 242, 1967, which all sides recognize to be the primary diplomatic document. Well, that proposal is supported by essentially everyone. It's theoretically, Europe's words, not very serious, but in words at least. The non-aligned countries that support it. The Arab League, states of the Arab League support it, we can go beyond. The same is true of the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, strongly supported. And in fact, it has even come to the Security Council, very much in the words that I just quoted. In January 1976, the Arab states submitted a resolution, which I just closely paraphrase. It was vetoed by the United States, again in 1980. I won't run through the rest of the record, but it's quite consistent. The General Assembly regularly has votes, overwhelming votes, almost everyone, maybe 2 or 3 opposed, the United States, Israel, some Pacific Islands sometimes, almost every year. The most recent one was just a few months ago in the General Assembly. It called for an end to expansion of settlements and declared the settlements illegal. Usual vote. Then came the Security Council that actually received some attention. In February, the Security Council debated a resolution introduced by Lebanon that supported about 120 countries, again calling on Israel to end the expansion of the settlements and declaring the settlements illegal. That one, a little to my surprise, pleasant surprise, Britain actually voted for it. They usually abstain. The United States vetoed it as usual. The veto caused a lot of surprise, which is itself kind of surprising because, as I said, this has been going on for 35 years. I was a little bit surprised because of illusions about Obama and the changes he was going to bring. All complete illusions, never any basis for them. And this is what just happened a couple of weeks ago. It was normal. So yes, there is a simple solution. Incidentally, the facts of the matter are not really a debate. I mean, the official U.S. policy is that the settlement expansion should be ended. That's what Obama vetoed. As for the settlements being illegal, that's not the least controversial. It was decided by an advisory opinion by the World Court with the acquiescence of the U.S. Justice and separate declarations a couple of years ago. The Security Council has repeatedly declared that the settlements are illegal. The U.S. Britain abstaining. U.S. sometimes vetoes it, sometimes it's through. More interestingly, Israel accepted. Back in late 1967, right after the 1967 war, when the settlements were beginning, their leading legal authority, distinguished international jurist, Theodore Meron, advised the government that any activities, any settlement activities in the occupied territories would be in violation of fundamental international law. The Attorney General of Israel confirmed that conclusion. It was even accepted by the Minister of Defense, who was in charge of the occupied territories, Marshal Dayan, he said, yes, it's true that what we're doing is in violation of international law, but states violate international laws, so we'll do it too, which is correct. They do violate it, and as long as the masters of the world don't raise a fuss, yes, you can do it. So he was correct. In any event, the basic facts are not controversial. What are the options today? Well, if you look at the debate about the issue, it's usually framed as if there are two options. This is true when you listen to Israeli authorities, to outside negotiators and commentators. They all accept essentially the same framework, that there are two options. One of them, the two-state settlement, which is overwhelming. As I said, has just overwhelming support, a lot by the United States and Israel. That's one option. The other option is that Israel will take over the entire region, simply incorporate it, as the Palestinian negotiators have put it, will give Israel the key, it can have everything. And then solidarity groups, Palestinian support groups and others say, okay, then we'll launch an anti-apartheid struggle, very much as in South Africa, and we'll try to win that one and achieve a democratic secular state. Well, there's a number of deficiencies in that conception, but one of them is that it's omitting a third option, namely the real one, the one that's being implemented and will be carried out, which is neither of those two, namely Israel and the United States, which work in tandem, will continue the policies now underway. They're very clear what they are, there's no secret about them. Israel will take over essentially anything that's of value in the West Bank, roughly half. Take over the territories behind what's called the separation wall, actually an annexation wall. And that includes arable land, main water resources of the region, the pleasant suburbs of the main cities, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, linked them with superhighways. It'll take over the Jordan Valley, a third of the territory, that imprisons what's left. And what's left is divided into cantons, almost completely by the salients that cut through. One big one to the east of what's called Jerusalem, actually a vastly expanded area called Jerusalem, illegally annexed by Israel in violation of Security Council resolutions. That time the U.S. even voted for them. So that cuts through, going through a major town, Min, which was built in order to subdivide the West Bank. A couple of others up in the north, going through these other towns of Ariel, Min, also established for this purpose. It leaves about half the West Bank administered by Palestinians, but imprisoned. It can survive. In Ramallah, you can have theaters, restaurants, rural areas, people won't starve to death, but no possibility of any form of independent development, let alone significant political autonomy. Well, that's what's being implemented right in front of our eyes, and that's the third option. That's the option that will continue to be carried out as long as the first option, namely a two-state settlement in terms of the international consensus, is not carried through. Can it be? I think it can be. In fact, it came pretty close in January 2001. Clinton's last month in office, he did permit negotiations, Israel-Palestine negotiations that took place in Taba, Egypt, working within the framework of what Clinton called his parameters. He said both sides accept the parameters, both sides had reservations. They negotiated on the reservations. According to their own testimony and independent observers, with a lot of evidence about this, they came pretty close to an agreement. In fact, at their last press conference, both sides said that if they had a little more time, they probably settled everything, all the technical issues, Jerusalem, refugees, and so on. Prime Minister Barak of Israel terminated the negotiations prematurely, and they never proceeded formally, they proceeded informally. But that indicates, I think, that if an American president will tolerate it, it's possible to imagine, and if, of course, the world supports it, that there could be something like the international consensus that could be implemented. And we don't talk about it abstractly. There can be demands for a very straightforward actions on Israel's part. The main one would be to withdraw the army, the IDF, from the occupied territories. So they're illegally located, withdraw it. And under international pressure from the United States, they would have to do that. And there are methods available to us, to Europe as well, to achieve this result. So instead of giving you my sense of it, a quote from a very respectable source, one that's been very cautious about being at all critical of Israel because of the funding, I suppose, Human Rights Watch. They issued a report quite recently which is directed to Europe and to the United States. To Europe, they said that the blatantly discriminatory practices make it an urgent matter for donor countries, that's Europe, to avoid contributing to or being complicit in the violations of international law caused by the settlements, means by their existence and everything related to them. The Human Rights Watch called on the EU, which they said is a primary export market for settlement products, to ensure that it does not provide incentives for settlement exports. All sorts of methods called on businesses to make sure they don't become engaged in such violations, including any operations that cannot be separated from discriminatory Israeli practices. That means everything. Discrimination of the kind practiced daily should be beyond the pale for anyone. Foreign governments and businesses at risk of being tainted by Israel's unlawful practices should identify and end policies and actions that support them. And notice that includes everything related to the occupied territories. Now that's a message to Europe, explicit, and it suggests actions that can be taken, which could lead to withdrawal of pressure to withdraw the IDF, moves on to accept the international consensus that has been sitting there since 1976 and has overwhelming support. So it's not as if there's nothing that can be done. There's quite a lot that can be done, namely compel your own governments to stop participating in criminal activities. Amnesty International has gone even beyond. It's called on the states of the world to declare an arms embargo on Israel because it's carrying out, it's using military force in violation of international law, as indeed it is. Actually, that's particularly crucial for the United States, where most of the arms come from. And Israel's use of these arms happens to be an explicit violation of U.S. domestic law as well. But that, again, these are prescriptions for everyone, for Europe as well as the United States, crucially the United States. Well, let me say a few words about the history, go through the details. The current relations between the U.S. and Israel are very tight relations, and the strongly supportive position of the European countries that actually dates from 1967. And there's a background, that's the 1967 war, which Israel conquered territories. There's background for that too. In the background, in 1967, was a war that was going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. It was being fought in Yemen, Oman. Egypt was the center of secular Arab nationalism, and that was frightening to the West, particularly Britain and the United States. British diplomatic documents way back that talk about what they call the virus of Arab nationalism. It's a virus because it stays in one place and can spread to other places. And Arab nationalism would undermine the control of these stupendous strategic resources on the part of early Britain, later the United States. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, is the center of radical Islamism. Also, as mentioned, the central funder of jihadism, spreading radical Islamism through the world. So naturally, the United States and Britain supported Saudi Arabia and tried to block Nasser, the danger, the threat that Nasser, Egypt might try to use the resources of the region for directing to needs of their own populations instead of the West and the royal families and so on. Israel resolved that conflict. It destroyed the center of secular nationalism and won a lot of awards for that. In fact, it was supporting Saudi Arabia quite openly. That's when the very tight relationship was established, and it's remained, with that being a large part of the reason. Shortly after, in the Nixon years, 1969, Israel was officially designated. The phrase was one of the cops on the beat. The way you run the area is kind of a framework for running the energy resources. You have to protect the dictators who make sure that we get the benefits, protect them from their own populations. That's why secular nationalism is so important. In order to protect them, you need a police force, cops on the beat, preferably non-Arabs. They do a better job of killing Arabs. So the cops on the beat in those years were the Shah of Iran, who was then an ally, close ally, Turkey, then an ally, controlling the Middle East, Pakistan, which was the royal guard for Saudi Arabia, and now Israel. They would all be in an alliance. They would be the cops on the beat. The police headquarters, of course, is in Washington, and there's a local branch office in London. That's essentially the structure of control of the region. And Israel's role as a cop on the beat led to an enormous increase in its military aid, closer strategic intelligence relations, and so on. And they remain. Very, very much so. Come back to it. Anyhow, that's kind of the basis of the core part of the relationship in connection with the energy resources and Israel's role in protecting them. Technically, Israel and Saudi Arabia are at war. In fact, technically, Saudi Arabia and Iran were at war. Remember, this is Iran under the Shah. But that was only former. Actually, they're allies. They more or less work together. That's why Israel and Saudi Arabia were the most outspoken countries in opposing the demonstrations that have been taking place in the region. Well, the withdrawal of the February resolution of the Security Council that I mentioned is really nothing new. As far as withdrawal is concerned, you might think superficially that a model for it is Israel's withdrawal of its military forces from Gaza in 2005. So if we could do it from Gaza and not from the West Bank. However, a closer look is important there. By the 1980s, late 1980s, Israel had come to recognize that it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to hold on to Gaza. It was already totally wrecked. substantial amount of the very scarce resources, mainly water, and protected by a large part of the Israeli army. And that didn't make a lot of sense. So Israel began at that point to sort of withdraw from the west, from Gaza, and to try to, what the real goal is, to try to push it off into Egypt. Egypt would take it. In 1991, Israel closed off Gaza, established a closure which separated it from the West Bank and the world, in fact. Separating the West Bank and Gaza has been a core Israeli policy ever since then. It's a disaster for the Palestinians. Meanwhile, the pace of settlement of the West Bank increased right through the 1990s, still increasing. All of this is described very well by Amir Haas, a really fine Israeli journalist who's lived in Gaza and now lives in Ramallah in the West Bank and has written extensively on Gaza and the area for many years. What she points out correctly is that the total separation of the Gaza Strip from the West Bank is one of the greatest achievements of Israeli politics, whose overarching objective is to prevent a solution based on international decisions and understandings, and instead dictate an arrangement based on Israel's military superiority. It's quite accurate, with one exception. It should be called U.S.-Israeli politics. They work together, as I've said. The United States provides the decisive military, economic, diplomatic support, also ideological support, and kind of framing the issues properly for Western audiences. And this is extremely harsh. It means, for example, apart from the fact that the people are living under essentially permanent siege, without much exaggeration, called the world's largest open-air prison. It means, for example, that students can't continue their studies in the Palestinian universities a couple of miles away in the West Bank. Patients who need medical care can't get to the hospitals, Palestinian hospitals in Jerusalem. Medicines can't come through, and the family visits are blocked. There's a little bit of leakage, but it's essentially the picture, and it's quite harsh. Meanwhile, constant repression intensified, and the Gaza Strip has been reduced to kind of a bare survival level. The abilities of people to survive in those circumstances, and even with some hope and a sense that there's a future, that's pretty amazing. Well, in 2005, August 2005, Israel did announce a disengagement from Gaza. That received great applause for how forthcoming and withdrawing from occupied territories. That's not what's happened. It's a very sensible move. They recognize that there's no point in trying to keep a few thousand settlers in Gaza. They should be moved to the West Bank, where they can, which is valuable territory, and they'll be settled illegally, subsidized in the West Bank instead of illegally subsidized for living in Gaza. Now, it would have been possible to carry out this transfer very simply. All that would have been necessary was for the government to announce that on August 1st, the army will withdraw from Gaza. Right at that point, a few thousand settlers would climb into the lorries provided to them and move from their subsidized homes in Gaza to the subsidized homes in the West Bank. That would have been straightforward, but it wouldn't have had the right propaganda effect. So it was necessary to stage a national trauma to make it look like a terrible trauma. So, some pictures on the front pages of a little boy pleading with the army not to destroy his home, cries of never again, and so on. So you could mobilize world opinion to support the permanent occupation of the West Bank. And that was carried over brilliantly. I mean, it did lead to some ridicule within Israel, but in the West, the propaganda were a beautiful major national drama, which made it even more of a farce, was that it was simply repeating something that happened in 1982. After the 1979 agreements, Israel was compelled to withdraw from Sinai, and the story there. But anyway, they had to withdraw. And at that point, they had settled extensively in Sinai, and they staged the same national drama. Instead of just withdrawing the army and separately, they went through the same routine that happened in 2005. Which I remember a headline, the Israeli press ridiculing this, called it national drama in 1982. But it's staged for the outside world, and they can ridicule it if they like, as long as the outside world buys the story. So they bought it in 1982, bought it again in 2005. What all this has implications for potential withdrawal from the West Bank can be done very straightforward, just as it was and could have been in these cases. Well, what happened to Gaza after that? Instead of giving my opinion again, I'll quote from the best Israeli sources, Edith Zertal, leading historian, Gil Eldar, who's their main diplomatic correspondent. They wrote that after Israel withdrew its forces from Gaza in August 2005, the ruined territory was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might, which can be exercised with supreme savagery thanks to firm U.S. support and participation and quiescence on the part of European allies. Well, that's an accurate description. Meanwhile, the attacks on Gaza continued. In January 2006, an important event took place, which intensified the attacks. In January 2006, there was a free election in Palestinian territories. That's the first free election in the Arab world. Very free, carefully monitored, everyone agreed, free, fair, and so on. It had a flaw. The wrong people won. The United States and Europe, and of course Israel, immediately reacted within days by announcing sanctions to punish the population for a major crime, voting the wrong way in a free election. And so that's right alongside of the passionate declarations of our love of democracy and so on. It's what George Orwell famously called doublethink. The capacity to have two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time and not to notice any problem. Almost a definition of the intellectual culture. Anyhow, the pressures on the Palestinians immediately intensified in punishment for this crime. The siege was instituted in June. A couple months later, the attacks escalated again. And on June 25th, an important event took place. Another important event, an Israeli soldier was captured by Hamas, Gideon Shalit. Huge outcry over the world over this terrorist crime. One day before that, June 24th, an unimportant event took place. Israel sent the army into Gaza City, kidnapped two civilians, Muammar brothers, spirited across the border. They disappeared into Israel's prison system, joining thousands of others, most of them without charges. Well, that's an unimportant event, so it got a few words in the press, and it was forgotten. Then there was, in response to the, In response to the capture of Shalit, there was a very sharp escalation of the military attack against Gaza. That's Operation Summer Rains. Shalit, ever since then, has been a pretext for Israeli siege and violence in November. In June 2007, another event took place. There was the U.S. Israel attempted to carry out a military coup in Gaza to overthrow the democratically elected government. This is the Operation Palestinian Authority, I should say. They attempted to overthrow the government. The coup was beaten back. Hamas crushed the coup, intensified its control. That led to more hysterical anger in the West about Hamas's terror. And the siege tightened. The attacks increased. Well, June, skipping plenty of things, which is a big important event. In June 2008, a truce was reached, ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. The conditions were that Hamas would stop firing these homemade rockets at Israeli settlements, and Israel would open up the siege. Well, what happened after that is interesting. Hamas lived up to the ceasefire completely. If you read Israeli official reports, they conceded that not a single Hamas rocket was fired. Israel, on the other hand, maintained the siege. In November 2008, Israel sent forces into Gaza, strongly violating the siege, breaking the truce, and then rockets were fired both ways. Palestinian as always. In December, the Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. Israel considered the offer, rejected it, and instead attacked. That was the Gaza attack, December 27th, murderous, all-out assault, fully backed by the United States. The United States blocked the Security Council ceasefire. President Obama had been elected at that point. He wasn't yet in office. He was giving talks about all sorts of topics, but when repeatedly asked if he had anything to say about the Gaza attack, he said he couldn't because there was only one president, and therefore he can't say anything about this one topic. The attack ended exactly when the inauguration took place. Of course, timed for that purpose, so that Obama wouldn't have to say anything about it. And what he could say is, well, let's forget about the past and look forward, and that sort of thing. That was Obama at that point did make one good move. He gave a speech in which he announced that he would have a negotiator for Israel, Palestine, and George Mitchell. And that's a pretty good choice. He was instrumental in negotiating the Northern Ireland settlement. It's quite good. However, Obama added in the speech that Mitchell wouldn't be able to do anything. The way he put it was interesting, and it passed without comment. What he said is, for the first time, there's a real opportunity for peace. The reason is that the Arab League had come out with its formal approval, once again, of the two-state settlement. Let's have a two-state settlement. And the Arab League had added that once such a settlement is reached, we should move on to normalization of relations with Israel. Well, Obama, in his speech, if you go back and read it, said, he said it's very good. The Arab League should live up to their proposals and should proceed to normalize relations with Israel. Obama's an intelligent, literate person. He knew perfectly well that was not the Arab League proposal. They called for a two-state settlement, and in that context, to normalize relations. Obama skipped the core of the proposal, protected sides. They go ahead and normalize relations, and everything will be fine. To anybody who was thinking that meant emphasize that while calling for an end to expansion of settlements, which is a footnote, really. It's the settlements, not expansion, that's the issue. While calling for that, he also made it clear that there would be no penalty if Israel didn't live up to that. George Bush #1 had, in fact, proposed a slight limit in sanctions for settlement expansion, not much, but something. And Obama's administration acted to remember to do that. This is completely symbolic, so that means that message to Prime Minister Netanyahu, go ahead and do whatever you like. And what happened since, and I won't go on with UN veto last February. It's just another step. Well, last May, Israel attacked a Turkish ship in international waters, 9 people, one American citizen, forced it into an Israeli port where the passengers were detained, finally deported. The ship was part of a flotilla that was attempting to bring humanitarian aid to besieged Gaza. This is a crime of piracy. In fact, theoretically, it should have engaged NATO. NATO should have responded to defend the Turkish ship under the NATO treaty. Turkey is a NATO member. Of course, that was unthinkable. But the crime of piracy on the high seas and the murders did arouse an international outcry outside the United States, where it was supported. Israel near total support. In fact, the picture in Israel, by maybe 95% of the population, is amazing that the world doesn't comprehend that the elite commandos who landed on the ship were brutally attacked by the passengers. So it's a real crime, attacking the commandos in international waters. Israel was also very surprised by the reaction, and there's some justification for that, because for about 3 decades, Israel has been hijacking ships in international waters between Cyprus and Lebanon, kidnapping passengers, killing them sometimes, taking them to Israel, sometimes holding them as hostages for long periods, sometimes kind of disappearing them into the prison system. So since it's been going on for decades, what's the fuss about another act of piracy on the high seas? Some justification for that. Well, in any event, in reaction to the international outcry, Israel did pledge to relieve the siege. In November, last November, the coalition of 21 international aid and human rights groups released a report on the effect of this relieving the siege. It turns out, as you would have guessed, that almost nothing had been done. So, for example, on construction materials, which is quite crucial to try to rebuild Cardiff, what Israel destroyed in savage January 2009 aggression, essentially nothing happened. The coalition reported that 7% of what the UN agency needs for rebuilding Gaza was delivered. The director of Amnesty International summarized the report and said, the so-called easing of the Gaza blockade does not change the fact that there's still a cruel and illegal blockade collectively punishing the entire civilian population. The only real easing has been the easing of pressure on the Israeli authorities to end this cruel and illegal practice. It's a message to us. Actually, there's been very little easing of pressure because there wasn't much in the first place. In the U.S., there was none, so nothing could be eased because the U.S. alone doesn't exert any pressure, but participates in crimes, as Europe does too, quite as openly. Well, the last what's time? Yeah. Okay, another monitor over there. I'll sort of finish with this. What's preventing peace? Okay. I mean, you can see what it's doing But it's not apartheid. In fact, it's pretty severe, but it's of the kind that's not uncommon in Western societies, including the United States, maybe. Certainly not what was true in the United States a few decades ago. In the occupied territories, the analogy also doesn't apply, because it's much worse than apartheid. Remember that South Africa depended on the black population. That was its workforce. So they had to take care of the Bantustans were pretty terrible, but they were sustained. They needed them. Israel doesn't want the Palestinians. It can just let them run, let them leave. So the result is that the pressures on them, the constraints on them are actually much worse than apartheid. So that analogy doesn't work either. But there is one analogy that does work. Someone brought up, but it's worth thinking about. Back about 50 years ago, the white nationalists in South Africa recognized that they're becoming international pariahs. The foreign minister called in the American ambassador, and we have the documents, and informed him that we are becoming an international pariah. We're being voted down at the UN and so on. But then he added that you and I both know that there's only one vote at the UN, yours. Meaning, as long as you support us, it doesn't matter if we're an international pariah. That turned out to be a pretty good prediction. In the following years, anti-apartheid campaigns grew and developed. By 1977, the UN passed an arms embargo. By about 1980, businesses were beginning to pull out of South Africa. The U.S. Congress began to pass sanctions against South Africa. The Reagan administration continued to support the South African nationalists right through the 80s, violating congressional sanctions, increasing trade, and so on. And there's a reason. The reason is what's the war on terror. The war on terror was not declared by George Bush in 2001. It was redeclared. Reagan had come into office declaring a war on terror. That was going to be the focus of U.S. foreign policy, the plague of barbarism, and so on and so forth. Part of the war on terror was the attack on Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. 1988, the Reagan administration once again declared the ANC to be one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. In fact, Mandela was only taken off the U.S. terrorist list 2 years ago. Now he can come to the United States without a special dispensation. But in defending civilization against terror, it was necessary to support South Africa, which was not only carrying out major crimes within South Africa, but was also involved in brutal depredations in the neighboring countries, killing over 1 million people. Well, that went on right through the 80s. And apartheid looked very firmly in place. The South African nationalists were triumphant. They had essentially won. ANC was suppressed. Maybe the world was yelling at them, but the one voice that mattered was supporting them. 2 or 3 years later, the U.S. shifted its policy. Mandela was released from Robben's Island. Steps were taken toward negotiation. And by the early 90s, apartheid had collapsed. It's not the only case like that. So I'm trying to give examples, but there are quite a few. And that could happen in this case, too. There is something to be hopeful and optimistic about, namely that the roadblock to a short-term settlement, not a true solution, but at least a short-term settlement, the roadblocks in the West, primarily in the United States, also among its allies, and that means you can do something about it. It can be done here, nations, or the U.S. can certainly be done here. For example, following the conservative prescriptions of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International directed to Europe, which is quite important in this case. There's a lot to say about things elsewhere in the region, but maybe I'll stop here.
Unfortunately, we're unable to take questions from the floor because the management, for some reason, in their wisdom, decided it was best to have only questions that were submitted beforehand. So they thought, there'd be a lot of rowdyism or something. But anyway, we do have some questions. Asking questions arise from what Professor Chomsky's had to say. But I shall read these questions. Some of them very sort of short and sweet, short and snappy, others are quite long. But I'll start with the short and sweet one, which came from Paul Chalmers. Oh, sorry. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, I was explaining we couldn't take questions from the floor, unfortunately, for management reasons, but I have quite a number of questions that have been submitted beforehand. So we start with one that comes from Paul Chalmers, who asks, in what geographical area or at what societal level do you today see the greatest potential for genuine political progress? To achieve this, a new philosophy would be needed. Then it goes on, how do you view efforts such as Michael Albert's participatory economics to think carefully about what institutions are necessary to bring about a more cooperative and equitable social order? And it goes on. and to what degree do you think experimenting and developing participatory institutions can help produce the kind of democratic culture that mass movement for a participatory society needs?
That's a plug for the people at the very bottom of that poster there. CNET, that's where it comes from. Must be a CNET participant. Mike Albert's an old close friend back from the days when he was a student radical who revolutionized MIT. Still today. And the participatory economics, these are interesting ideas about how to organize a society with direct participation in all institutions. It's along with the participatory economics, there's a side movement called power politics, participatory politics. That one's organized mostly by his friend Steve Shallon, also a former MIT student who participated in the 60s, really shaking the place up. And these are interesting ideas, certainly worth pursuing. I mean, they come out of a long tradition of left Marxism and anarchism, which was highly critical of the Bolshevik Revolution, as which they regarded as a kind of right-wing, autocratic movement that was intended to have succeeded in destroying United Kingdom, one version of it. There are many versions. One was G.D.H. Cole's Guild Socialism, also worked out some much more ideas. So there's a long tradition of it, and the anarchist tradition are extensive. And occasionally there's been successes in implementing elements of this. The most important one was in the revolutionary Spain in 1936, crushed by the combined forces of fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. They disagreed about a lot, but they agreed on destroying the revolution. Mike Albert, Steve Shallow, Robin Howell, economists who's worked on this, have worked out in considerable detail a particular version of how this might proceed. Well, you can certainly worth thinking about it, and the efforts make sense. You can ask, and I do ask, we can argue about this, whether the prescriptions are too detailed. Again, there's a long-standing debate in the left tradition about this. If you read Marx, for example, you discover that he said almost nothing about a post-capitalist society. There's a couple of sentences scattered through his work about you fish in the morning, up in the afternoon, kind of boilerplate. But he didn't say anything about post-capitalist societies for a reason. He thought that the structure of a post-capitalist society would have to be determined by the participation of the working class when they had achieved, in his view, control over the society. And he didn't say that. I assume the background thinking is there's just too much we don't understand. I agree with that. And answers will have to be discovered experimentally by trying to organize more participatory systems, which can be done right now in pieces, and seeing how they work. Do we know, for example, whether it's possible for, as Albert and Sheldon believe, it's possible for information about production, say, to be made available to the democratically functioning workforce in real time so they can make sensible decisions? Or, for example, would it be necessary to, or valuable, to allow for the kind of information system that does exist in markets? To an extent, they're information systems. They give the information about what should be produced. That doesn't have to be associated with remuneration. It doesn't have to be associated with control of giving orders or anything like that. It's just another information. It can be viewed as another information system. Well, that's a technical question. What's the answer? Nobody knows. You have to try it and see. Try bits and pieces and see. And the same is true of other kinds of social organization. In any event, there is a division of opinion that goes way back as to the detail in which it makes sense to try to describe what a future society should be like. Paracon and parapolitics think you can do it in great detail. Others are more skeptical. It doesn't have much implication for action. Either way, you try. Let's see. And it can be done in small pieces. And the anarchist theorist Bakunin used to say that we can create the germs of the future of the present society. You don't have to wait until there's some massive revolution. In fact, that's the way to create revolutionary change, develop bits and pieces of it in ordinary life, from family life to production units to other institutions to international society. Very concrete things that can be done with a long-term goal or a lifetime.
Nicely, you mentioned G.D.H. Cole. G.D.H. Cole you mentioned. There's a very nice story about Margaret Thatcher. He was visiting Cole's college, and this was just after the miners' strike in 1983. One of the slogans of that strike was "Coal, not dole." And she was being shown around the college by the master, who had some sort of left-leaning sympathies. And he pointed to the portrait of Cole and said, that's one of our alumni, G.H. Dole. And she corrected him. She said, no, Cole, not Dole. Anyway, another question, which comes from Samantha Biller. And the question is, do you think that these protests in the Middle East, especially that of Egypt, will affect successful permanent change? Or do you think that after a few months, the inspiration and motivation of people will vanish? And how important do you think the international media's role is in this?
I don't think anyone can predict this sort of thing. I don't think the protesters know. I don't think Western governments know. I mean, they know what they want. They want opposite things. But how it will work out actually depends to a significant degree on what people like you do. These things don't happen in a vacuum. Government decisions, especially in partially democratic societies like ours, do have to reflect organized, active public opinion. If the public is silent, passive, obedient, distracted by consumerism or whatever it may be, circuses, then governments go ahead and do what they like. That's true whether it's a totalitarian government or a formally democratic one. If the public is active and engaged, they can't do what they like. They have to adapt to it again across the spectrum. So I think the answer to that question is, I don't know, nobody knows. Depends in large part on what people like you decide to do. Not just here, of course, but everywhere. But right now, the way things stand, the regimes are still in place. The names have changed. And the name changes carry significant consequences, I mentioned some. So the security forces in Egypt have been badly battered. There's now quite a free press in Egypt for the first time. In the labor movement, say the Mahala complex, where a lot of this originated, April 6, 2008, there are workers apparently, there isn't much reported, but it seems that workers are taking over plants and implementing on their own ideas that are not too dissimilar from Aragon or from G.H. Cole or from left Marxists like Anton Pannekow way back about the worker management industry, where they Ken Coates or the Russell Foundation, Ken Coates, which are still Institute of Workers' Control in Nottingham, which have been working on these things for years. They're just doing, well, how far can that go? If it goes far enough, it'll be a real revolution. If it's controlled the way the Wall Street Journal wants and repressed, there'll have been a regime change. There'll be a change of names, a significant change of names, less violence, less repression, more openings, but essentially the same socioeconomic political system and control. That's the struggle that's going on right in front of our eyes. And how it turns out depends on how the various forces in the world, including public opinion in the West, react to it. But it's not a moment for speculation, but really action to determine what the answer to the question will be. To repeat the questions because Professor Chomsky doesn't adhere to well at the moment. So if you'd like to ask a question from the floor, then I'll relay them. Yeah. Oh, I'll need to ask. Yeah, okay. Take the mic up.
devolution in the US to state level in the past. Given that school children in Wales are funded to the tune of £604 per child, the levels of corporate welfare and subsidies have been soaring over the last 10 years to both multinationals and small and medium-sized businesses. Why is it that so many of what we refer to as the left still refer to devolution as progressive?
It's a combination of my bad hearing and Welsh English, which is not. So why is devolution regarded as progressive? I mean, I regard it as progressive. It seems to me it's moving decision-making power closer to the population. And what's done with those opportunities, that remains open, but at least it provides some sort of mechanism for steps forward towards really functioning democracy. So, what's the role? I didn't mention anything about the role of AIPAC. You know, the big Israeli lobby in the United States. It's a significant lobby, undoubtedly, but let's be a little realistic about this. AIPAC is dwarfed by the military lobby. They're both dwarfed by the business lobbies. And the biggest lobby in the United States is the Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, American Petroleum Institute, and so on. You know, it's a business-run society. If they wanted to put AIPAC out of business, they could do it in 5 minutes. As long as the business world is basically supportive of what AIPAC is pressing, and as long as the U.S. government supports it, then they're influential. But if they step out of line and act in ways which Washington doesn't want, and which the business world doesn't want, they're gone. It's happened over and over. I'll give you a long series of examples, but there are plenty of them. So just a couple of years ago, for example, in, what was it, 2005, I guess, this is the Bush administration, very supportive of Israel. Israel has it's a military-based economy, and its economy is based on military export, high-tech military export. Well, there's a couple of markets for that. One of the biggest markets is China, so they're very eager to expand their high-tech military export to China. In the year 2000, they tried to do it, and Clinton clamped down, told them you can't do it, so they backed off. In 2005, they were trying to upgrade Chinese missile systems, and the Bush administration told them you can't do it. Israel, Prime Minister Barak's a lot of speeches about how we're in a country, we'll do what we like. The United States quietly informed them you're not going to do it, and furthermore went out of its way to humiliate them. The U.S. insisted on a public apology for their trying to do something that Washington told them not to do. They refused to allow high Israeli military officials to visit Washington. They got the message. They backed off. Throughout this period, not a peep from AIPAC. They're not idiots. They know they can't stand up against U.S. power, or for that matter, business power. And if you just think about the way the country is run, you know perfectly well, you should figure out very quickly that no small lobby, ethnic lobby, is going to be able to overcome major interests in the country. In fact, if could give many other examples. But for the most part, they get what they want. But that's because they're in line with the interests of the government and real power. So take the military lobby again, which, as I said, dwarfs that. Israel, they're delighted with aid to Israel. I mean, take, say, Lockheed Martin, plane manufacturer. When the United States gives a $3 billion grant to Israel to buy jet planes, it's great news for Lockheed Martin. In fact, even better news than that, because the aid to Israel is regarded as what's called a teaser in retail stores. You sell something cheap so people will buy something else. You give aid to Israel, then Saudi Arabia comes along and says that we want 10 times as much. And that's what happens. So now, in fact, after the latest grant to Israel, Obama made a $60 billion deal with Saudi Arabia for advanced military equipment. Now, what's sold, Israel doesn't mind, because what's sold to Saudi Arabia is second-rate equipment, which they can't do anything with anyway, except maybe repress their own population. So that's fine. Britain does exactly the same thing. Cameron recently made some statements in favor of the uprisings. He also went, I think, to Qatar, to an arms bazaar or something, to advance the sale of the British military equipment to the dictators, who he's saying, you guys got to go. For a long time, talk about British support for the dictatorships, which goes way back, has really had two elements to it. One is to ensure control of the energy resources of the region to prevent the virus of Arab nationalism. But the other is straight financial reasons. I mean, there's a huge contribution to the British economy by the transfers and the investments from the Kuwait Investment Fund and the purchase of military equipment by Saudi Arabia and others. So I think it's great. Same with the U.S. military industry. Delighted with this. And furthermore, there's direct cooperation in advanced military industries. So, for example, one of the WikiLeaks exposures the last couple of months had to do with this. In fact, it listed from American diplomatic cables. It listed sites around the world that the U.S. government regards as of such strategic importance that they have to be protected, no matter what. One of them is right outside Haifa, the Rafael military industries. It's Israel's major military industry. Well, that's a U.S. strategic site. In fact, Rafael has transferred a lot of its operations to Washington, because they're in closer connection to the masses, the people who give the money and make the decisions. The integration of these systems are very close. In fact, the same is true of high-tech industry altogether, which is pretty closely related to the military industry. For example, Intel, which is the major chip manufacturer in the world, they're producing a new generation of chips, which they expect to be the standard for the next coming years. They're doing it in Israel. They're building a factory in Israel. They just put another $2 billion in to produce high-tech chips for the world. That's fine for them. Skilled workforce, lower wages, support from the government. Kind of like investing in China. I'm sure that's great. And in fact, if you look at in the United States, just take a look at where the strongest support for Israel is. In the media, by far the strongest support is in the Wall Street Journal. And they're not funded by AIPAC. That's the business newspaper. The Republican Party is much more extreme than the Democrats. Jewish money and votes go mostly to the Democrats. Whereas the Republicans, the ultra-business party, who are a little more extreme in support across the board. In fact, if AIPAC were as powerful, the lobby, if it were organizing meetings, and having demonstrations, and all the tons of activities that people in the activist movements carry out. The very simple tactical consequence of the belief that the Israeli lobby is very powerful. Namely, put on your tie and jacket, go to the headquarters of the American Chamber of Commerce, IBM, General Electric, and so on, and politely explain to them that their interests are being harmed by U.S. support for Israel. Well, as soon as you convince them, okay, they'll change the policy. But why doesn't anybody draw that conclusion? Because it's ludicrous, you know. I mean, of course, you can't have a lobby which is overruling primary, powerful interests that essentially direct and determine policy. So that they're, you know, apex important. And within a certain spectrum, as long as more or less tolerated by the government, tolerated or maybe supported by business and the right wing, they have leeway. If it isn't, they don't. We should bear in mind that there are other factors that enter very significantly into U.S., British, Australian support for Israel. I mentioned what's sometimes called the Anglosphere in the foreign policy literature. England, everything came out of it. So Britain, the United States, Australia, Canada, that's called the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere is an interesting phenomenon. It's a special kind of imperialism, which Wales knows very well. It's settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is the worst kind of imperialism. It means not only imposing your rule over what you conquer, but sometimes exterminating the population, as in the United States and Australia, to a large extent Canada, and settling, you know, taking over. That's settler colonialism. Well, settler colonialism is a very deeply rooted kind of intuitive concept in the Anglosphere history for hundreds of years. And that means there's a kind of instinctive sympathy for Israel. It's another settler colonial society. You know, getting rid of the natives, the backward natives, and taking over, putting, you know, modern society there. That's what the Anglosphere has been doing for centuries. So it's supported. Alongside of this, further support comes from Christian Zionism. The Christian Zionism goes back way before Jewish Zionism. It was very powerful in England. England, as you surely know, was a very religious country. Leading figures were, you know, reading the Bible and believing. People like Lord Balfour, for example, were, you know, remember the Balfour Declaration, and they were very religious believers. And the Bible says that, you know, that God promised the land of Israel to Judah. So when Allenby conquered Jerusalem in 1916, there were headlines in the newspapers comparing him to Richard the Lionheart, who finally drove the pagans out of the Holy Land and restored it to its rightful owners, Christianity. Corollary to that is, okay, now it's time to fulfill God's will and let the Jews return to Israel. But this is incidentally not the evangelical movements. I'm talking about the elite mainstreams, people like Woodrow Wilson, for example, or high-level people in the Roosevelt administration, who Harold Ickes, for example, said that the return of the Jews to Palestine is the greatest achievement in the history of the human race. Well, you know, if you're a believing Christian, you can understand that, following God's will. Later comes the evangelical movements. It's like the end times movement. You know about the big movement in the United States. Support elsewhere as well. particular version of evangelical Christianity based on some reading of the Revelations, which says that there's going to be a major war in Armageddon, everybody slaughters each other, the people who are saved rise to heaven. It's wonderful. Jesus comes, 1,000 years of peace, and the Jews get exterminated, except for 144,000 of them who, I don't know where that number comes from. I guess the 12, something about the 12 tribes. And they convert, so they're okay. It was the most anti-Semitic movement in history, and Hitler didn't go this far, but very strongly supportive of Israel, and Israel strongly supports it. But that movement really took off in 1948, because that was the first sign of the Second Coming, the forming of the State of Israel. These are not insignificant things. In fact, these are very deeply rooted, even in not just evangelical circles, but also elite circles. And in some ways goes way up. Reagan apparently believed a lot of this stuff. His handlers kind of kept him quiet, so sorry, Reagan, shut him up. But there were no hints to indicate that he probably believed it. But George W. Bush almost certainly did. And here's an interesting incident, which I didn't believe when I heard it at first, but it's been confirmed. In January 2003, right before the Iraq invasion, when the United States was trying to mobilize the European support for the invasion, Bush met with Jacques Chirac, president, and to try to convince him to get France to join. In the course of their discussion, Bush brought up a very obscure passage from the book of Ezekiel, the Bible. There's a passage there which plays a big role in evangelical mythology. This passage nobody understands. This passage is about how Gog and Magog come from the north and attack Israel. And nobody knows whether Gog and Magog are people, places, or whatever they are. For Reagan, it was Russia. That's Gog and Magog. For Bush, it was Saddam Hussein. So he started talking to Chirac about this Gog and Magog business. And Chirac hadn't a clue what he was talking about. So he approached the Élysée, the French Foreign Office, and asked them, what is this maniac raving about? They had no idea. So they approached a Belgian theologian. That's how I heard about it. He sent me something he wrote. He wrote a kind of a disposition on this passage and how it's interpreted and so on and so forth. So maybe they could figure out what Bush is talking about. Well, I read it. I didn't believe it, frankly. It just was too crazy. But I mentioned it to an Australian researcher who I know, and he looked into it. And it's true. It shows up in the biographies of Chirac and so on. Well, what does this mean? This means that somebody sitting in the White House, the most powerful person in the world, is a believer in extremist evangelical lunacies.
Noam, firstly, thank you very much for coming to Cardiff. It's a real pleasure to hear you personally. Can I just ask, there's a suggestion that what's happening in North Africa at the moment is really, the nature of the conflict in North Africa is really about an ethnic conflict between Shiites and Sunnis. Do you think there's any credibility to that view?
The question was, do you think there's any credibility to the view that the conflict is about Sunni and Shia in North Africa and the Middle East?
There were two questions then, one about Wisconsin. What happened in Wisconsin is extremely important. Right in the around end of February, one important moment in the Arab world uprisings was when Kamal Abbas, he's one of the major labor leaders in Egypt, and a leader of the January 25th uprisings, and he sent a message in the name of the Egyptian labor movement to the workers of Wisconsin and said, you showed solidarity with us in our struggle, we want to show solidarity with you in your struggle. That's pretty important. That's what the labor movement has been about for, back into the 19th century, about solidarity, working people supporting each other internationally, and in fact all people doing it. It's an important moment, and it's real. I mean, what's happening in Egypt and Wisconsin is the two trajectories are kind of crossing, they're going in opposite directions. In Egypt, working people and others are struggling to gain rights that have been denied them by the dictatorships. In Wisconsin and other states, they're trying to preserve rights that had been won by hard struggle and are now under serious attack. So the far right in Wisconsin, which had a ton of money behind it and happens to have political power, what they're trying to do, I mean, the pretext is deficit, kind of like England, nothing to do with deficit, it's easy to show. But the pretext is that because of the deficit, they have to eliminate collective bargaining rights. Zero to do with the deficit. But the idea is try to destroy the last vestige of the union movement. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why business hates unions, and anyone associated with it hates unions. And with all their flaws, the labor movement has been, organized labor movement, the major barrier to the total destruction of democracy and the takeover of these are major struggles everywhere here too. I mean, you're not going to have anything like a functioning democracy if there's no barrier to total corporate takeover of the whole system. Whatever the pretext is, efficiency, deficits, or whatever it is trumped up. And the attack on collective bargaining is a serious part of this. It's quite striking. I didn't anticipate, I don't think anyone anticipated the scale of the uprisings in Wisconsin. It's been pretty impressive. 70,000 people out on the streets occupying the state capitol for weeks. They had a lot of them, about two-thirds, according to polls, about two-thirds of the population supports the Wisconsin workers and their right of collective bargaining. So the right-wing corporate-backed Republicans are fighting quite a powerful popular force, but no political force. So for example, if you notice, President Obama has not said a word about this, barely a word. There is no organized political force that stands opposed to the concentrated corporate system. There's a pretty simple reason for that, too. elections in the United States are by now like a total farce. They're what? You can predict quite well which candidate is going to win just by looking at campaign funding. In fact, you can also predict what policies they will follow by looking at the concentration of campaign funding. I did extensive political science work on this. The next election is expected to cost $2 billion, and it will probably be a lot more than that. So, not surprisingly, Obama, take a look at his recent appointments, they're all coming straight from the corporate sector. You know, his latest appointment to deal with jobs is the CEO of General Electric. Got most of the workforce overseas and most of the profit from overseas. But plenty of money right at the core of the financial system, the corporate system. Those are the ones who are going to buy the next election. So Obama and the people around him will be very quiet about the Wisconsin uprisings. In fact, Obama himself has struck pretty hard blows against the unions. Remember, what's involved at this point is the public unions. The private sector unions have been almost destroyed. What's left is the public sector unions. The private sector unionization in the U.S. is below 7% of the workforce now. It's really destroyed. And the public sector unions are still alive. In the lame duck session of Congress, this session after the election, before the new Congress takes over, Obama was very greatly praised for his moves towards bipartisanship and the legislative achievements. This is last, December or January. What were the achievements? Well, the main achievement had to do with tax policy, a gift to the very rich, the super rich. So a major tax cut for the super rich. That was very strongly opposed by the population, but Obama gave it away. Well, they're the guys that are going to buy the next election for him, antagonize them. At the same time, he announced a tax increase for federal workers. Now, they didn't call it a tax increase. They called it a pay freeze. But you think for 30 seconds, the pay freeze for public sector workers is identical to a tax increase, to the same thing. Comes out, the numbers come out the same. So he announced a tax cut for federal workers and a tax decrease for the super rich. Announced a further freeze for federal workers for 5 years. Again, a tax increase, which of course goes out because of population growth, inflation, and so on. Well, it's all happening at the same time. The attack on teachers is particularly interesting. It's part of a very broad campaign to try to destroy the public education system. It's happening here too, by privatizing it. That way you make sure that it's going to be fine for the rich and everybody else can worry about themselves. That's the way capitalist society is supposed to work. So you want to get rid of this defect of the public education system. There's a line behind that attack, and also the attack on pensions, Social Security, and so on, is, I think, an ideological point. You have to understand that the business world tends to be very class conscious. Marxists, vulgar Marxists, they're always fighting a bitter class war, and that has to be fought on ideological grounds as well as policy grounds. Now, there are certain beliefs that you have to drive out of people's heads because they're dangerous. One major one is solidarity. If you want to make sure that people think about only themselves, I need more iPads. I don't care what happens to disabled widow across the line. That's the way you're supposed to be. And great efforts were made to try to turn people into that. Because solidarity is a dangerous notion. Means people can get together and stand up against concentrated power. What do you think of the public school system? That's based on the concept of solidarity. Like say, I don't have children in school anymore, but therefore, if person, I would say, I'm not going to pay taxes. Why should I pay taxes so that the kid can cross the street and go to school? Okay? Or take Social Security. It involves nothing to the wealthy, you know. But for most of the population, it's their survival. But why should I care if I'm wealthy enough to take care of myself? If that disabled widow across town has food to eat, that's a bad idea. You've got to knock that out of people's heads and start some child. This lies behind attacking public education and other public services. And these are forces, ideas that bring people together to create a more livable and decent, free, democratic world, which is very much counter to the interests of concentrated power. So all this stuff is going on in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's not like a center of it, but it's happening all over. Major struggles, counterparts right here. Not hard to think of, and Europe and so on. Well, what about Sunni and Shia? There has been a Sunni-Shia divide in the Arab world, not in the Muslim world, for a long time. But it was kind of muted. What really exacerbated it and turned it into a major devastating force is the U.S. British invasion of Iraq. Take a look at what happened there. In the early days of the occupation, Sunni and Shia were living together, as they had been all the time. You know, they were saying, you can go back and read it, that we're not going to fight each other, we intermarry, friendly, and so on. Now, after that, by about 2005, the effect of the invasion had led to conflict. And once you get those conflicts started, they've taken a life of their own. You know, Catholic and Irish and Protestant Northern Ireland, they've taken a life of their own. You know, you killed my cousin, and I killed your uncle, and that sort of thing. And pretty soon there was a major civil war in Iraq. Baghdad is kind of destroyed. You know, communities are ethnically cleansed, barriers between them, and so on. One of the reasons why the main reason violence is reduced is that people are separated from one another. Segregated army. People kill right next to them. And that's the rhetoric of the Arab world. Lebanon, everywhere. So by now, yeah, there's a major Sunni-Shia conflict. However, I don't think that has much to do with what's going on now. Except in one place, two places, in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia. Bahrain is extremely significant, and you'll notice that the West is no nonsense about democracy in Bahrain, supporting the king, the dictator. Bahrain is a Sunni dictatorship with a largely Shia population. It's right across the causeway from eastern Saudi Arabia. Eastern Saudi Arabia is largely Shiite, and it happens to be where most of the oil is. There's a kind of an accident of history and geography, which has put most of the world's oil in Shiite-dominated areas right around the northern part of the Gulf, the eastern Saudi Arabia, southern Iraq, and Iran, Shiite Iran. And there's been a concern way back in Western circles that, you know, this might be some kind of alliance, which would mean that maybe some independent Shiite movement would have much of the world's oil under their control. That's totally intolerable. Bahrain also hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the major military force in the region. So for lots of reasons, the West is going to do everything it can to keep things from boiling over in Bahrain and, of course, Saudi Arabia. That's what happened yesterday with the war. So yeah, there's a kind of, there are Shia Sunni conflicts strong in Iraq, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Except for this case, which relates to the control over oil, I don't think that's been part of the Egyptian, Tunisian, and other uprisings.
could we have the mic back?
Just a quick one. Mr. Chomsky, I'd like to thank you for what you said today. I find it very, very interesting, particularly on the issue of Palestine. But I have to ask this question, considering the 9/11 perpetrators, the majority of them from Saudi Arabia, and then you switch on the television, you hear about terrorist training camps in Pakistan. I have friends sitting over in Afghanistan at the moment, always worried about their safety. What are your thoughts on Afghanistan? Did we pick the right country? Do we have a right to be there?
Short answer, no. Just take a look at the situation now and don't forget what to say about that. Right now, what's happening, actually it's came out in WikiLeaks, some of the most important revelations that had to do with cables that the American ambassador in Pakistan sent back to Washington, Ambassador Patterson. She's quite supportive of the Afghan-Pakistan operations of the United States, but she did point out a problem. The problem is, first of all, Pakistan is an extreme, maybe probably the most dangerous place in the world. Pakistan has huge nuclear weapons capacity, which is growing very fast, maybe the fastest growing anywhere. It's been accelerated by the U.S.-India nuclear treaty from a couple of years ago, which Obama is supporting, which essentially grants India is not a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. India, Israel, and Pakistan are three non-signers. This essentially amounts to support of the United States for India's nuclear weapons program. That's not the way they put it, but think it through. That's what it amounts to. And Pakistan understands that. So they're, in reaction, building up their own nuclear forces. That's one tendency in Pakistan, nuclear weapons. The other is radical Islamization. That's not a majority of the population, but there's a strong radical Islamic movement, and it's not just tribal areas. You've seen the reactions to there were a couple of assassinations of the leading figures recently, one a couple of days ago, who opposed the blasphemy laws, and they were assassinated. And there was huge public support for the assassins, okay, including reformist elements. So these lawyers who were demonstrating to overthrow Musharraf and reform the government, they're supporting the assassin, demonstrating support of the assassin. These are powerful tendencies. Well, both of these are among Ronald Reagan's gift to the world. In the 1980s, Pakistan was ruled by the most vicious of the rotten dictators it's had. And he had two major policies. One, developing nuclear weapons. The other, radical Islamization. And he was strongly supported by the United States and Britain. The U.S. pretended that they didn't know that he was developing nuclear weapons, which of course is nonsense, so they could keep supporting him. And the Islamization was with Saudi funding. And Saudi Arabia, since the early 60s, has been kind of on a missionary kick to spread radical Islam to the rest of the world, with strong British support all the way through the U.S. too. And this reached Pakistan in the 80s. That's these famous madrasas where kids don't do anything but study the Quran and learn about jihad. And that's changed a younger generation. All right, anyway, these two things converge. What it means is that there's an immense nuclear weapons system, and there's a powerful radical Islamist movement, and they interact among the tens of thousands of people working on the nuclear weapons system. There's a fair number of radical Islamists. Pakistani nuclear physicists would say that it's not impossible that fissile materials will be taken by these people undetectably through small quantities and could turn into a jihadi bomb, a nuclear bomb going off in London or New York. Well, and what Patterson points out in these cables is that the U.S. policies are contributing to this. Pakistan is strongly anti-American, overwhelmingly, and that includes the military, the one stable force. And U.S. actions in Afghanistan and Pakistan, like drone attacks or pressure to the Pakistani army to go into the tribal areas, or just a couple of weeks ago, the assassination by this U.S. CIA agent, Raymond Davis, of 2 people, just plain assassination. In Pakistan, it's believed that the 2 people he killed were ISI agents who were trailing him, intelligence agents. I don't know if it's true, but it's what's believed, and that's what matters. All things like that are seriously antagonizing not only the Pakistani population, but even the stable force that's kind of holding the country together, the military and intelligence. And what this couple of years ago, even at that time, Patterson pointed out that this is leading to a possibility where there might be a nuclear weapons in the hands of jihadis. I mean, that's a frightening consequence, a serious mainstream analysts are quite concerned about it. There's an article which you might take a look at, you can probably pick it up on the web, by Anatol Lievin. He's a very highly respected foreign policy analyst who works mostly on Pakistan, knows it very well. He goes through some of this, and it's in the national interest, conservative foreign policy journal. He points out his kind of punchline in the article is that American and British soldiers are dying in Afghanistan in order to make the world more dangerous for Britain and the United States. And that's quite apart from the concerns properly raised. We have to consider in the first place. This isn't just straight practical grounds and practical consequences.
Okay, we are coming quite close to shutting out time now. There was one question I wanted to put from the pre-submitted questions. It comes from Adam Johannes, who's a great local movement shaker and activist. And he asks, it's quite a long question, but the gist is, do you agree that enforcing a no-fly zone over Libya now, the Americans and British and other European powers, would that be a genuine help or aid to the project, or is it just another expression of trust in commercial and diplomatic interests?
Well, before we think this is a hard question, I don't think I have a simple answer, unlike some of my friends do. But we should be clear about what's going on. The immediate concern, allegedly, is the humanitarian crisis. But that's pretty hard to believe. There are humanitarian crises all over the place that the EU never made out of everything, so trying to stop the fact from carrying it out. Furthermore, if you think for a minute, there's a very simple way of stopping the humanitarian crisis. The rebels would call off the revolution. So what's really at stake is, should NATO support the revolution? Should it support the revolution or not? Should it support the rebellion against the government? That's what's actually at stake. Well, of course, if the rebellion goes on, there's going to be a brutal reaction, or already is, on the part of Gaddafi. So there is a humanitarian issue, but it's, the actual issue is, should the West support the rebellion? Okay, and if you want to think about it seriously, you can't put aside the central issue, which is not discussed. Well, you've got to make your own decision about that, but I think a case can be made for a no-fly zone. A case can be made. I don't know what's say it's right. Because there is a humanitarian catastrophe resulting from the vicious reaction to the rebellion. Okay. Then comes the question, should the U.S., Britain, and France implement it? Just take a look at public opinion in the Arab world. It's pretty much the same in Africa. It's well known, doesn't get reported, but it's well known. So, for example, in Egypt, about 90% of the population think that the United States is the worst threat to their interests. I don't know if the question's been asked about Britain, but I bet it would come out the same way. France, I'm sure it would come out the same way. They don't regard it, in the Arab world, they don't regard Iran as a threat. In fact, about 10% of the population think that Iran is a threat. In fact, opposition to Western policy is so strong that a considerable majority think the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, it's about 80%. This is very significant. These ought to be headlines. This tells you exactly why the West, the United States, Britain, Europe, cannot tolerate democracy in the Arab world. And democracy would mean that these views would enter into policy formation. Britain, the United States, Europe would be out of there. We'd lose the main lever for control of the world. It's not going to happen easily. Well, this relates to whether these countries, the hated countries, and they're hated for good reasons. The West may not like to think about history, but victims have a different view. There's a history, and I don't have to repeat it to you, but there's good reasons why the Western powers are really hated. For Italy is not a major actor in world affairs, but the same is true there. So it turns out the first post-World War genocide, real genocide, was in eastern Libya, the part that's now liberated, carried out by the Italians. The Italians don't like to think about it, but you can be sure they remember. So there is this kind of huge burden borne by the Western powers. If they do anything, even if you can imagine there are noble motives behind it, it's hard to imagine, but even if you imagine that, anything they do is going to have consequences. For example, it could sharply increase humanitarian catastrophes just because of the whole baggage that's there and the reaction to it. And, the African Union has been very quiet about this because from their point of view, part of what's going on is an attack on Africa by the West and indeed by the Arab. And that evokes all kinds of memories of the slave trade versus other things. So you have to understand what you're getting into if there's military intervention of any kind, even no-fly zone. Well, maybe also there's another question. If there is to be a no-fly zone, why should it be these countries carrying it out? I mean, the most respected country in the region, by far, is Turkey. Turkey is a native power with a huge air force. They can carry it out. Egypt, by now, is a respected country in the region after the uprising, and they have a pretty substantial military force. They all have the capacity to issue no-fly zone. If they're not doing it, we should ask, why are they not doing it? And should we be doing it when the regional powers want to? I should say that Turkey has supported the uprisings. In fact, Prime Minister Erdogan, Turkish Prime Minister, is far and away the most popular leader in the region. He was also the most outspoken in support of the uprisings. He wasn't Blair or Obama. He came out strongly in support of it. Well, he's not calling for no-fly zone over Libya. Why? I mean, there are regional concerns that we just can't ignore. All of these considerations should come into play in making a decision as to whether to implement a no-fly zone. discussion. And unless it's brought in, it's not a serious discussion.
This has to be the last question. It's a complicated question, I suppose, really. And it's a sort of local interest, a British question. And it has to do with, we've had a couple of questions going by text, in fact, from Robert Cardiff, but the gist of it was, at what point does it become justified, given a really bad government, and in this case, a really regressive government, socially and politically, doing all kinds of probably irreparable damage to things like the NHS, higher education, and really wrecking a lot of life. At what point does it become appropriate for people to take a lesson from what's happening in the Middle East? For people to take a lesson from what's happening now in the Middle East and say this is now too bad to be tolerated and we have to take some kind of, I mean, there's a big rally in London which will be happening very soon. At what point does it become justified to take what would seem very drastic action in the British context? And the other question, which might bring Jodie in again, has to do with freedom of speech. He's been very much on the sharp end of some pretty brutal behaviour aimed against freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and it ties in with that other question. At what point do these things become intolerable?
It's yourself. In my view, they become intolerable pretty early on. The attacks on freedom of speech. I mean, it's now in British law. You know, after 7/7, the terrorism attacks, and there was new legislation which makes it a crime to say or publish anything that might provide some support for or encouragement of potential terrorism. Actually, there's a court case coming in England about a bookstore, bookstore, I think it is, where the owner is being charged with carrying material which, from jihadi sources, I mean, you know, for serious, that's the kind of material we should be reading. I don't know what they're about. But he's carrying material from jihadi sources, and naturally this material glorifies jihad, gives reason why should do it and so on. So he's being brought to trial, and the case is coming up in a couple of months. Well, these are pretty serious attacks on freedom of speech, and they're showing up in other ways too. Some in the United States, incidentally. Into if you like. But at what point do you do something about this? You know, it's pretty serious. The social policies being carried out, not for me to decide, I think they're really outrageous. In fact, this is happening all over Europe. This is one case in which I tend to agree with the Obama administration against Europe. Europe is now, Cameron's an extreme case, but all over Europe, the economic policies are to introduce austerity at a time of serious recession. Well, that's crazy. I can name that. Herbert Hoover's policy in the late 20s, and it created the Great Depression. Roosevelt came in, the New Deal kind of reversed it. But then in 1936, under business pressure and some more ideological pressure, Roosevelt went back to a kind of Hooverism, withdrew the stimulus because of the deficit, and sank the country right back into recession. Then got out of it, marching through the war. But there's both economic theory and history and just plain common sense that tells you that at a time of limited economic demand, because industry refused to invest and corporations refused to invest, banks don't alone lend, at that kind of time, and when they're in fact giving themselves plenty of bonuses. Read the front pages of the British newspapers I say, the Vodafone case is an interesting, you probably know all about this, what they call United. Forget the name. Pretty young people who've been organizing and picketing with the Vodafone equipment because based on their, I think it was Cameron, just essentially gave them £6 billion for not paying taxes and tax havens. And this is expanding. I mean, there's plenty of money around. It's going into the pockets of people who have the power to keep it. But it's true that investment is down and consumer demand is down after the major crisis. There's only one source of demand, that's government spending. And if that's reduced in the austerity programs, it's going to be a very hard serious effects on the economy, on human life, of course. There's a deficit, but the way to get out of the deficit, which is longer term, is to get the economy to grow. Then you get out of deficit. I mean, I know the details more in the United States, but I think it's the same in Europe. So I think these are extremely dangerous policies in general, and I don't think they're undertaken for the purposes of dealing with deficits. It doesn't make any economic sense. I think they're undertaken, there's a principle in law which says if you want to determine an intent, look at predictable consequences. That's strong evidence for intent. And the predictable consequences in this case are quite obvious. They're going to harm the poor, they're going to harm working people, they're going to break up popular organizations like unions, they're going to affect teachers, firefighters, and so on. That's the consequences. Meanwhile, the bonuses are going into the pockets of bank managers, Vodafone, you're doing great, and so on. But those are the consequences. So what's the intent? If this was a necessity, if there really was no alternative, Thatcher's famous statement, well, okay, you have to bring up error, but that's nowhere near the case. So but then comes the question of how do you react? This isn't Egypt. You don't have to overthrow a dictatorship by mass uprising. There are parliamentary mechanisms that can, parliamentary mechanisms that can be used to change policy. And that's why to go back to Karl Marx, when he was talking about global revolution, he suggested that in England, one country that had a sort of functioning parliamentary system, he said in England a major revolution should come about through the vote. It doesn't have to be a popular uprising. Well, I'm not talking about revolution, but I think the same logic applies. But there's nothing more than
Cardiff University couldn't host my talk because of security concerns. I think maybe they saw the footage from the demonstration and they were worried about me attacking them. But I think what's interesting about the rise of new alternative forms of media, and particularly the internet, is that we now can view events as they are happening rather than as they are reported, and the corporate media no longer have a complete monopolization over how we view events. But it's important to recognize that the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia were never inevitable, and no one could have predicted them. Ben Ali didn't give the Tunisian people their freedom. Mubarak didn't give the Egyptian people their freedom. Those people demanded their freedom. And as Professor Chomsky said, conditions here became intolerable a long time ago. So it's time that we demanded our own freedom.
In the Temple of Peace, which is in Edward Avenue, at 11:30 a.m. Okay, so get along to the Temple of Peace if you can, to hear him. And let me also thank Mr. Chomsky for a really uplifting, terrific, inspirational talk. At various times over the last, 40 years, I have to say, when I felt sort of depressed with British politics and the prevailing cynicism and apathy, I picked up one of his books or read one of his articles, and it's been a never-ending source of inspiration and fresh hope. It's also really encouraging to see so many people here. I can't think of many other speakers who have filled St David's Hall. I can't think of many other cities. Cities where so many people would turn out to hear what was a really vital and urgent talk. It's like Gertrude Stein said of Oakland, I actually live in Oakland, California, there's no there. Well, there's a there in Cardiff. There's a real grassroots socialist tradition, and this is spectacular witness to it. It's terrific. And thank you very much. I would like to give you, as a token of our esteem and fond memories, this Welsh love spoon. I think it'd be...
Also, not just for your time, but for your money here today.